Corporate irresponsibility leads to environmental and cultural devastation. This has been happening in the Amazon for the last 48 years. In 1964, Chevron, operating under the brand of Texaco, discovered that a remote northern region of the Ecuadorian Amazon, known as the Oriente, held valuable oil underground. For the next 26 years, Chevron harvested that oil at the expense of the people, animals, lands, and cultures of the Amazon rainforest. In 1990, when the company left Ecuador, they left their operation to be run by the ill-equipped Ecuadorian oil company Petroecuador, who continued to perpetuate the environmentally hazardous practices introduced by Chevron. They also left behind 18 billion gallons of toxic waste water that had been pumped into the rivers, 17 million gallons of spilled crude oil, and hundreds of open toxic waste pits. Going against their own environmental safeguard policies, best practices for drilling, and legally mandated precautions that they abided by in the United States, Chevron recklessly contaminated an area in Ecuador the size of Rhode Island with mass amounts of toxic waste left over from the harvesting of underground oil deposits. Chevron had even patented a technique for safe reinjection of produced wastewater that would have protected the ground from contamination, but chose not to use their own techniques because it was going to take away from their profit margin. By choosing economic gains over safe environmental practices, Chevron showed no concern to the effects their drilling would have on the indigenous people of the Amazon. In 1993, 30,000 Ecuadorians filed a class action lawsuit against Chevron in New York. 7 years later, the U.S. courts sided with the Chevron's first objection to any ruling of a U.S. court and ruled that the case should be held in Ecuador. Then in 2002, an appellate court upheld that case's move to Ecuador and stipulated, as part of this decision, Chevron is bound to abide by any judgment for or against it in an Ecuadorian court. Because of this, a ruling against Chevron in Ecuador will be enforceable in the United States. When the case was refiled in Ecuador, its legal system required more investigation into the actual environmental and humanitarian damage. After 2 years of inspections from different expert scientists working for the plaintiffs, Chevron, and an independent court-appointed group, evidence showed severe contamination at many of the sites left by Chevron. Even with these inspections and a ruling by the Ecuadorian courts that Chevron must pay $18 billion for their environmental cleanup, the oil company refused to comply and filed an appeal. As recent as this month, Chevron's fight to avoid paying the $18 billion owed to the Ecuadorian people was hit with another judgment by a U.S. appeals court. An earlier order to block Chevron from the responsibility of paying the judgment was lifted. Every major battle in the long legal pursuit for justice has been lost by Chevron, yet Chevron still refuses to comply with court judgments. By refusing to claim responsibility for the toxic disaster they created in Ecuador, Chevron is refusing to acknowledge that its actions caused harm and death to the indigenous people of Ecuador. The same rivers Chevron dumped its waste into are the same rivers the community bathes in and uses for their drinking water and irrigation. The exposure to the toxic chemicals dumped in the water and that seeped into the ground from the unlined waste pits were known to cause hazardous health issues. The people of Ecuador have suffered major medical problems such as blood poisoning, brain, stomach, liver, and kidney damage, respiratory problems, cancer, miscarriages, birth defects, and ultimately death to some because of the reckless disregard for human and environmental life shown by Texaco. This disregard for human life and the land that sustains and supports that life is what inspired the creation of multiple humanitarian and environmental activist groups to stand up and support the fight of the Amazonian indigenous people against Chevron and other corporations that want to take advantage of the people and resources of the area. Amazon Watch is one such organization. As a nonprofit organization, Amazon Watch was founded in 1996 to advance the rights of the indigenous people of the Amazon basin. By building a partnership with indigenous and global organizations, they campaign to persuade key global decision makers to honor the people and land of the Amazon over the capitalistic gains gotten through threatening vulnerable areas and populations. They strive to educate the local and global community about what has and is happening in the Amazon in hopes that people will realize that irresponsibility leads to contamination, which ultimately can lead to death. Death to the land is death to the people. Death by oil is what my sculpture Chevron Toxico is about. This artwork was created in response to learning the plight of the Amazon people and Chevron's total disregard for the indigenous people and environment of Ecuador. Layers of acrylic, wax, wire, and sticks symbolize the layers of toxic contamination and the multifaceted effects of Chevron's reckless actions. The foundation of the board is coated with colors reminiscent of what is found in the oily sludge that contaminates the land. Remnants of trees struggle to escape the weight of the poisonous oil. Figures are trapped in the oil, struggling to free themselves from the toxic slick only results in their continued deterioration. A trinity of ancestral spirits project through the mounds of wax as if emerging from the oil-covered Amazonian ground, all three in different stages of deterioration, without sight or sound, yet hoping to be seen and heard. Chevron Texaco is my way of letting the world see the devastating effects of irresponsibility and disregard for the very environment that sustains our global community, and to hear the voices of the marginalized. The Amazonian rainforest and the rivers that run through it are vital to the global climate and water supply. When that is contaminated and destroyed, so are we all. Hopefully, as more awareness of this inhumane contamination, decimation, and injustice builds, it will instigate more action towards corporate and personal responsibility, accountability, and preservation of our global community.